We hear so much these days about self-regulation and impulse control with our dogs that it's time we had a jolly good sit down to chew over these concepts and get a better understanding of what all of this means, especially when it comes to the dogs that we live and work with. So many trainers and behaviourists post about regulation, saying that when dogs have the ability and option to self-regulate, it gives them crucial skills to cope with new challenges in the future. But what is self-regulation and how can we expect, like really expect, our dogs to regulate? Is self-regulation something that we should be talking about with dogs? You're here today to find out. When I'm putting my presentations together, I often think of my clients' dogs when I'm trying to make sense of behaviour, and today's topic led me to think about Thibaut, who was a Bichon cross. Thibaut hadn't had the best start in life. He had been bought by an older couple who wanted a dog for company, but they hadn't bargained on a puppy, and they hadn't bargained on Thibaut needing quite so much, well, dog stuff. He was bought at 10 weeks of age and then shuffled onto his next home, his second home at 16 weeks, and then arrived as a matted, stinking ball of unclipped fur in the shelter, aged 11 months. Thibaut had had quite the wild ride already. And he was also really struggling. He wouldn't eat or drink for long periods for a start. He spent most of the time at the shelter in the office just barking unless somebody picked him up or held him or engaged with him. He went almost immediately into foster and there he barked almost all night long, even though he was tucked up on the couch right between the caregivers, the foster family. They were really experienced foster carers and they had expected hiccups, as they often expect hiccups, but Thibaut was really feeling all of those big feelings. He was also really anxious around the male fosterer. He was frequently biting his legs and his trousers as he was walking past. He'd often perch on the back of the sofa as well during the day and bark at anybody else who went by. And Thibaut really struggled with his doggy friends too. So the fosterers had two lovely elderly beagle matriarchs, females, who helped many young dogs find their feet, and Thibaut moved between almost constant humping and getting into fights with them. They were sterilised, but he'd hump them, he'd hump the female caregiver, he'd hump his pillow as well. Thibaut really just seemed like he wanted to play with them in those brief interludes between the humping, but he was too boisterous even for a Bichon and he'd constantly bark at them. It's fair to say that Thibaut was struggling on every single level. Physiologically, he was showing signs of chronic stress. His eyeballs were constantly on stalks. He grimaced almost constantly. He was panting most of the time he wasn't barking. His poor little man was chapped red raw as if things weren't bad enough from all of the humping. He'd had tummy upset after tummy upset, and even in the foster home he wasn't eating. So he really was struggling to settle down, even though it was a brilliant foster home. We were really lucky to have them. Emotionally, Thibaut was really anxious. He was trigger stacked all of the time and he was also really fearful, but he was also pretty feisty. He was unafraid to nip at his male caregiver or if anyone tried to pick him up. Although his foster family had tried really hard to give him enrichment activities and food toys to keep him from being on the back of the sofa shouting at people, he lost interest really quickly and then he would even start whining or crying. On walks, he was hyper-vigilant the whole time. He didn't even stop for a pee, so he wouldn't go to the toilet outside. He was peeing in corners in the foster home as well, but he was unhappy to go outside and doing his business, even in a garden. His foster carers were following a basic puppy house training before. It wasn't their first time at the rodeo, and they were being meticulous about it, but they'd stand outside for hours and Thibaut wouldn't go. And the moment he came back in again, he'd sneak off within minutes and then find somewhere new to pee. But his relationships were also suffering. He was shadowing his female foster carer and he was struggling if he couldn't see her or be near her, and yet he was also really aggressive to his male foster carer, running after him to bite at his legs. So Thibaut spent most of his time being managed in that foster home. The two stately beagle ladies, who were brilliant, but they'd had enough as well, and the relationships there with his canine friends were also really frayed. Thibaut was a walking embodiment of a dysregulated dog. But what could we do about that? And I'm sure that's what you're here to find out. So if you live or work with dogs and you recognise similar features in them, even if hopefully not quite as many, then this is for you. So thank you very much for joining me. For those of you who don't know me already, I'm Emma. I cut my teeth in the shelter world as a trustee for 6 years. I've now been working dogs with a professional capacity for almost a decade, and I've moved outwards into private practice as well for local work with local associations, shelters and fosterers and foster care networks. So most of my private practice work is now with bite cases, which is sadly more frequent, enough to keep me busy. And I live currently with my middle-aged Malinois, former problem child Liddy, now reduced as I am to battling middle-age spread and trying to remember where she left things. She's currently sleeping on a couch. Perfect example of a dog who regulates a whole lot better than she used to. So we've got a big topic today, one that's both timely and also right on the edge of cutting edge of developments. We cut across neuroscience, biology, ethology, developmental psychology, comparative cognition, veterinary behaviour, genetics and behaviour science as well, whenever we think about regulation in all of its forms. So we're going to take a short and very fragrant romp through some massive topics, but I know you're ready for it. So first we're going to consider what regulation is. We need to always define our terms and consider the different factors within it so that we can better understand it. We're also going to think about physiological or biological regulation, emotion regulation, cognitive regulation, social regulation and prosocial regulation. Well, there's some big old words, but hopefully they will all make sense by the end. We'll also be considering the difference between self-regulation, which many people see as the gold standard of regulatory processes with dogs, and thinking also about regulation by others, supporting regulation, if you will, which may be more common in our work with dogs or our lives with dogs, especially as we support them towards progress and healthy adaptation in this world. It may seem like a really trivial consideration, but it is really important. So on the one hand, we know where dogs have got control over what happens to them, control over outcomes. It can help reduce anxiety or uncertainty, as well as building up our dog's competence to cope with the world. And yet, on the other hand, this can actually take quite a lot of self-management, and to expect social mammals to regulate and manage their bodies, their behaviour, their emotions, their cognition, and their interactions with others is a very tall order. I spent literally most of yesterday fending off people on social media who were struggling to regulate their own behaviour, and they're grown-up adults. I also want to stop for a moment so that we can all just find our bearings a little bit. With a whacking 447 definitions of regulation in one study across all of the various contributory fields, it's easy to get lost or to misunderstand what these terms actually mean. How do we know if we're all talking about the same thing? So having seen self-regulation used as, it's kind of like a less than pejorative synonym for self-control or impulse control, people just using it as exactly the same, for people who don't like to think of it in such coercive terms, it's really important that we're not just paying lip service to regulatory processes, simply to remove from our language anything that whiffs of coercion that we don't like, while simultaneously just carrying on with what we were already doing under just a nice shiny relabeled banner. I've even been asked for less pejorative terms for impulse control by some people who wanted to share my post. I totally get that we don't like that term, but regulation is, and it involves controlling and inhibiting many aspects of our body and our behaviour, as you'll see. It shouldn't simply be a fashionable synonym because we think control is a dirty word. It is not. Without it, we wouldn't go very far in life. Whether we are a jellyfish, an alligator, a hyena, or a human being, we all need a little bit of impulse control. But impulse control is a subset of regulation, so we need to think more broadly in order to be accurate. So we'll be considering about how regulation develops in dogs, looking at postnatal processes and even what happens before birth sometimes, before we consider the main ways in which regulation develops as our dogs develop. There's a lot of reasons that our adolescent dogs may be struggling and why so many of my clients have teenage dogs. It's Christmas Eve and I've already been contacted, or it's almost Christmas Eve, I've already been contacted by 3 people this morning about teenage dogs. So we know it's a big problem and those dogs are all struggling to regulate in one way or another. We'll also be thinking about ways in which regulation is a social process, as well as a bodily, an emotional, a cognitive, and a behavioural process as well. Indeed, I don't think of emotions being distinct or separate from what we might consider social or interactive. And I'll take you through all of the ways that development of regulatory skills happens in social situations as well. We'll also look at a little bit of dysregulation and what happens when our dogs are unable to regulate effectively before we consider how we can help them move through that and support their regulation and, dare I say it, occasional dependence on us as their caregiver. I want to also take you through 8 fundamental processes by which we can support our dogs as they learn to take charge of their own bodies, their behaviour and their emotions. You'll notice as well that if you've read it that there's a lot of overlap between the Lighten Up Resilience roadmap. There are reasons for that. The Resilience Roadmap is a guide to take our Tybalts of the world, our Liddies, from dysregulation through to self-control in ways that build competence, skills, confidence as well. Hurrah! So let's get into it. So let's start with the definition of self-regulation. I am actually taking this definition from that of early years practice with young, sometimes pre-verbal children, since ideas about regulation in animals aren't very well defined yet. And we've got a lot of definitions that we can actually pick from. So this definition that I work with, it actually feels as good as any of the others. As Dr. Minay Jonkboyer says, self-regulation relates to our ability to manage our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviour in ways that are healthy and growth promoting. That's such a lovely definition. I mean, that's our job, isn't it, as caregivers? Managing ourselves in ways that are healthy and growth promoting, is there anything better? It feels very 21st century. Of course, this is a definition aimed at human children, and so when we think about animals, we may draw more useful links to non-verbal or pre-verbal humans, such as young infants. Certainly, we can also start to think of ways that our dog might manage their emotions themselves and their behaviour as they age and they too become adults in their own species. So for our dogs, puppy biting is a really nice example. At first, puppies are driven by the bitey impulses of a small land shark, and as they age, they usually learn to manage their impulses to grab the ears, tails and noses of other dogs, or grabbing skirts, trousers, shoelaces, slippers and bags. They learn also that their actions have got consequences, that other dogs might not want to play with them or get into fights with them, or humans start disengaging and finding a trainer, whatever their flavour, to help them, which may, for some puppies, mean very severe and draconian punishments or support for their acquisition of these skills in much more gentle and kind ways. So we've got to think of our dogs as kind of learning these things as we develop. And at the moment, as I said this morning, I've already had 3 people contact me. One's got a 10-month-old, one's got an 11-month-old, and the other one is just a teenager as yet. And so we've got to think about how our dogs learn these very vital skills, because around about this point is where people start to notice that things are going wrong and their dogs aren't managing very well, and to think about ways to teach them those skills. I think that we can all agree, no matter how we feel, that if our dog were a 4-year-old adult German Shepherd dog and they were still biting as hard as they did as a puppy or struggling to disengage, then that would be a huge problem that would no doubt lead the guardians to consider behavioural euthanasia at that age. I think the pressure point for my clients who've got younger dogs is either around 6 months if the intensity of those bites never dissipated and it's severe enough to draw blood, or around about 10 or 11 months as it seems to abate from time to time, or it's hard but it's not breaking the skin or leaving bruises. But an adult dog of 4 biting like a fired up 14-week-old, well, that would be an issue for most of us, I think. And biting is just one example of behaviours that puppies do that we don't expect adult dogs to do. So that behaviour, those inhibition of bite strength, that regulation of arousal, of emotions, of behaviour, the way our dog interacts with others, that's our regulation at work. So you can see why impulse control is sometimes used as a synonym there, although regulation is much more broad and wide phenomenon. Without an ability to regulate their body, their emotions, their cognition, and their behaviour, our dogs' welfare would be hugely compromised. They can't live as social beings without these skills. Their relationships suffer as a consequence. A dog who doesn't know how to cope on their own and turns their frustration on a couch may end up compromising their guardian's legal affairs, their finances, their relationships with the neighbours, or even the authorities. Dogs like this may also compromise their own health. They get crown fractures because they can't stop chewing, broken teeth sometimes, or they've ingested toxic materials. Being unable to regulate costs a dog significantly when it comes to relationships and their ability to function healthily. Just this morning, I read in the newspaper about a dog who, and it sounds kind of funny, doesn't it? We all dream of, have nightmares about these scenarios. But it was a dog who interrupted with teeth his guardian having sex. And the dog is now at risk because how they did that, they were an adult dog and they interrupted in ways that were inappropriate for adult dogs to do, especially for a dog that was a big 30 kilos, 40 kilo dog. So whether it's biting, humping, interrupting guardians having sex, it's more complicated than just biting or these behaviours, not least because we're working in such an ill-defined field. So according to that one study, there are at least 447 definitions of self-regulation out there in the world, mostly focused on self-control, a few of which connect to animals. And this makes it especially tough for us to know how to proceed, since there will be that inevitable conceptual misunderstanding that will impact on us as guardians, as caregivers, as trainers when we're working with animals, especially if we're struggling with some parts of our dog's behaviour. For instance, in some sources, self-regulation means management of the self by the self. In others, it's control of the self by the self. And perhaps most unhelpfully of all, when we're trying to define regulation, regulation of the self by the self. Very simply put here, I mean, it is to be how our dogs manage stress, generally speaking. Most people don't like the notion of control anymore, and there's a lot to be said for caution around that word. I'm not a fan of management. It makes me think of 1970s workplaces and David Brent in The Office. So regulation is a word that sits most comfortably with me, but it's not one that we're all familiar with and not one necessarily that we would all use. When dogs can self-regulate, they're not reactive, in inverted commas, to the environment. They can self-soothe. They can take themselves off onto the couch when their guardian is talking. They can choose different behaviours to get their needs met when they're in challenging situations. It might look like a dog who can choose to back out of a play session by slowing down the tempo or disengaging, by shaking off and walking away. It might be a dog trying to get the last impossible treat out of a Kong wobbler and choosing to walk away before getting destructive. It might look like a dog who growls rather than biting impulsively. Regulation may be or may not be a conscious process. We don't know. It's not like our dog decides that social media is very triggering today and they best steer clear. But we definitely know dogs who know when it's time to change tack, when it's time to hang back. My boy Heston would always put himself to bed around 7 p.m, taking himself off to the dark and quiet bedroom rather than staying in the living room where quite often I was teaching until 9 p.m. or so. Seeing Liddy change from that grabby, frantic, frenzied teenager she was when I first met her, through to the dog who seems to recognise now when play is getting her a little hot under the collar and going and taking herself off for a brief interlude. It's been watching regulatory skills for her develop in real time. It's been a real joy to see her build up her own competencies and sometimes need a little bit of support as well. Perhaps, her self-awareness now is much better that she's about to fizz over and take herself away for a break before reinitiating play, for example. But that's definitely what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking about regulatory skills developing in dogs. And just as an example, Liddy struggles with new people in her life who move around. And she struggles, as many dogs do, with tall people. She struggles with men. So just last weekend when my brother was here, she's only met my brother once before, although she's seen him plenty of times and she knows his smell. when he stood up, he'd been sitting down for the most of the afternoon and behaving himself as I told him to do. But when he stood up, I could see that she was starting to get a little bit like, what's he doing? Her ears went back, and I started to notice some small signals in the changes of her behaviour. Those are things I'd never seen before. And what I was noticing there is that she was managing a lot better, and that she was managing to control herself a lot more than she would ever have done before, where she would have gone straight to those big and explosive behaviours. So if you're here as a dog trainer, by the way, and you actually want something more animal based and more academic, then I really highly recommend that you look at Manning and Dawkins 2012 copy. I think it's called An Introduction to Animal Behaviour. It's got two wolves on the front, and in there's a specific chapter about the development of impulse control, and it's just a really useful introduction to how that works in animals and how that works in birds, and right the way up to more complex mammals who live in large social groups. So the bigger the social group that we live in, the more we need these skills in order to even live in those situations in the first place. And certainly everything to do with Liddy's regulatory processes, much of that involves how she behaves in social groups. And so actually seeing that develop in real time has been really ace. And also knowing when I need to support and when not. So just for example, with my brother, she was approaching him sometimes, and I was saying, okay, so throw the food away behind her. If you think that if she's standing there a little bit long, just get her to disengage just a little bit. And a couple of times she needed a bit of a prompt to be able to do that, and she was more interested in the food than she was in my brother. But as time went on, she was less interested in the food. She would go over for petting, and he would stop and he would do that pet pat pause and see if she was still, volunteering to be there, and she absolutely was. So it was really nice to see two beings working together to help each other and to help each other both feel comfortable, which was amazing. Certainly a world away from Thibaut, but we got there in the end. So we can think of regulation as having 8 attributes as far as dogs are concerned. The first of those is being able to choose the appropriate intensity, duration, or frequency of behaviours in a situation. Suzanne Clothier talks about proportion in behaviour, and this is exactly what I mean by appropriate. An adult dog who jumps upon their guardian in an absolute frenzy after 2 minutes of separation perhaps doesn't have that ability yet. Thibaut was exactly there with his female guardian. His behaviour just wasn't proportionate for that situation. At the same time, though, when assessing a dog who's bitten or a dog fight in a multi-dog home, my first question often relates to how intense was the fight, how proportionate was the bite for the situation, how much provocation was required to generate that response. And quite often the dog is absolutely given the right intensity despite what happened and how much they were provoked, and even in emotionally charged situations they used just the right amount of force to stop. Thibaut definitely did not have this skill, just like Liddy at the beginning of her interactions with me. Often Thibaut was choosing completely the wrong level of engagement with the Beagle ladies, for example. So it wasn't just his relationships with humans, but it also affected his relationship with dogs. The second attribute is the ability to self-soothe, to settle, and to be able to bounce back from upset, to feel comfortable in your own skin. This is also part and parcel of the wider concept of self-regulation that's entirely appropriate, I find, for dogs. So those of you who are familiar with the Lincoln 2020 paper on separation-related behaviours will be aware, for example, that 4 of the 7 principal components in separation-related behaviours actually relate to frustration. Treating a dog who's got no idea how to self-soothe and relax during absence, even if that's me giving attention to the computer right now, a dog who doesn't know how to cope with that, that's different than treating a dog whose response to absence is almost phobic in nature. I see every day in my clinical work dogs who feel uncomfortable in their own skin, unable to understand how to feel good in making their own decisions, how to feel good relaxing by themselves, depending all the time on other humans or on dogs to fill the void, exactly like Thibaut did. And of course we've got that kind of interaction between don't feel comfortable in my own skin and anxiety sometimes. And it's hard to know sometimes which is the most predominant of those things, but certainly what we would expect is that when a dog can't get our attention, or they've had lots of attention during the day anyway, that they would be able to take themselves off and just to settle from time to time, exactly like Keston putting himself to bed at 7 p.m. and going, that's it, I've had enough of today, and going off and helping himself sleep better by choosing a dark and quiet place rather than listening to me rattle on in the background. So impulse control is the third aspect of self-regulatory processes that we would expect to see in an adult dog. From curbing their impulse to bite as hard as they can, not jumping over fences even though they could, or resisting the urge to pounce on next door's cat, a dog who's got strong self-regulatory skills will be able to do that. As you can see though, impulse control is part of regulation. It's not a synonym for it, and therefore I don't think we should be using, or we can use, regulation or self-regulation to mean impulse control, because impulse control is a part of regulation, and as you've seen already, it's much broader than impulse control. Being able to go off and go settle and feeling comfortable with yourself, that's not impulse control, is it? So focus on a task is also, it's the fourth part of regulatory control, and choosing where to pay attention. So of course this is also part of that master skill of impulse control, where we actually see the role of cognitive function in self-regulation. So for dogs who struggle to focus on a specific task, like scent work for instance, or quickly lose interest as Tybalt did, these are facets of self-regulation. So Tybalt has some big struggles focusing on things, be that his caregivers or simple enrichment tasks, that he was spending too long focusing on things that were unproductive or unfruitful, and not able to spend any time on actual doing things like enrichment tasks or anything that was slightly hard. He would just lose interest in them really, really quickly, and not necessarily because he wasn't that interested in food, or he wasn't interested in play, or he didn't know how to. He just struggled to get that balance right about how to control where his attention went, and that's part of regulation. This involves the dual skill of ignoring distractions, which is our fifth regulatory skill. So like focus, this voluntary cognitive process of deciding what do I need to pay attention to and what things can I ignore is part and parcel of what we think of as regulatory skills. So not only did Tybalt struggle with this, he also actively spent time trying to engage with distractions. For instance, scanning the environment on walks for things that might bug him rather than actually paying attention to the smells around him. But he was also struggling with things going on outside the window as well, even when there were things inside the house that he could have been more interested in and were actually more fruitful, more enjoyable, more pleasurable. He was choosing to ignore those and pay attention to things that were unproductive, unfruitful, were actually winding himself up and making himself feel worse. Prosocial behaviour is also part of self-regulating. So this involves all those canine codes of behaviour about play, engagement, appeasement, displacement behaviours, even conflict resolution behaviours. So not only do dogs have to know these canine codes of conduct to get along with other dogs, but often they need to know another code as well, that of humans, and sometimes other animals as well, like cats. Again, as you can see from Tybalt's description of this was definitely an area in which he was struggling. So he was over-engaging, and when he was engaging with other animals, it was often at a really big level, that number one skill. And just for example, today on social media, I saw a beautiful meme that said, your friendly, in inverted commas, dog is simply rude. And I so often find that those dogs are, oh, it's okay, he's friendly, are using such big behaviours that it's no wonder so many of the dogs that they approach are having a very strong reaction to that. The last two skills relate to frustration and impulsivity as well. The first is the ability to delay gratification. So as you know, there are several components to frustration tolerance, but being able to cope with a delay when you can't get something immediately is perhaps the most obvious of that. We should also maybe consider how dogs cope with non-reward or downshifts in the quality of the reward. I see many dogs who are unable to cope if they deviate from their routine, for example, or if they can't get what they were just having. And this lack of ability to tolerate flexibility is also part of frustration mastery. So wherever we see struggles to self-regulate, we should also think about carrying out an assessment for both frustration and for impulse control as well. Finally, the final self-regulatory skill we might consider with dogs is the ability to persist in the face of difficulty. So ironically, many dogs who struggle with frustration actually also find it really difficult to spend the appropriate amount of energy on a task. Like, when should we continue, or when should we disengage? When's it getting too hot for us to handle? These are core skills that we simply expect quite often our dogs to just have when it comes to things like agility, where we need focus and an ability to ignore distractions. We need persistence. We need the ability to delay gratification. For dogs who do search and rescue work, for example, or assistance work, you can see just how many of these skills it actually require. And even for our average companion dog, they're going to need a fair few of these skills just to get through life. Thibault struggled even with easy food enrichment toys. Just even the simplest things, he gave up really quickly. But it was the same in play if anybody tried to engage him with a toy. Not only did he lack persistence with those skills, but he also had a little too much persistence when trying to engage in other things, like when his beagle housemates were saying, "No, I'm not interested in playing, it's time to sleep." These 8 skills comprise what I consider as self-regulation, as a kind of single entity. They include emotion regulation and the ability to cope with things like frustrating situations, but they also include cognitive, social, and prosocial skills too. Professor Stuart Shanker, who works with children, theorises that self-regulation for children falls into 5 domains. And as soon as I saw this model, I thought this works really well for animals too. I like it. It's simple and it's clear. His model, I find, is really applicable to our companion animals. It's a really useful way as well to think about self-regulation as in its entirety. So his first domain covers physiological or biological self-regulation, such as the ability to nourish ourselves and know when we're hungry, drink water when we're thirsty. It's funny, I had a conversation with a client who had a border collie. He described this collie as ADHD. I asked him why. I often ask people why they describe their dogs like this, and he said he had ADHD and he felt like his dog had similar symptoms. One of the major symptoms he described to me on that day was his inability to regulate his body. He was very thin. Quite often, he said, he'd get absorbed in playing a video game and not listen to his body telling him that he was hungry. And then his hunger would get completely overwhelming, but he'd be so hungry that he was too hungry to wait to prepare things. So he'd often eat a lot of snacks and then binge on snacks or go out for a takeaway really quickly. And he said his dog was exactly like that with play and water. But knowing when he also needed to go to the toilet, for instance, for his dog, not him, that if his dog was involved in play, he'd forget to go for a pee, and then he'd break out for a really, really long pee, but he didn't seem to notice that he'd finished, and he'd wander around and he was still peeing. My client said that he felt like his dog didn't really listen to his body very well, and how he felt exactly the same. I felt like that was such a profound insight. Physiological regulation covers simpler things like our ability to regulate our own temperature, move out of the sun, and also to choose comfortable places to sleep. Like Heston putting himself to bed in a dark space, Liddy she chuffs when she gets worked up and she wanders off from play for a lie down. As you can imagine with puppies, the mothers do a lot of this regulation for them, even regulating their bladder and their bowel movements until the puppies become more independent. And then we have got that kind of crossover period as the puppies start to recognise the signs that their bladder is full and it might need a wee. But do all of our dogs know and learn those skills? And that conversation with my client really woke me up, because I'm quite sensitive to I'm very sensitive to when I'm hungry. I woke up this morning and my tummy hurt because I ate all bad things yesterday. It's Christmas, and I was very sensitive to that pain, but and also to the fact that I was hungry. So I know when I need to eat, and I know when I'm starting to feel a little bit dizzy. But I just kind of think that's how everybody operates in this world, and to know that there are other humans who they get so absorbed in what they're doing and they are unable to recognize that they're hungry or that they're thirsty or that they need to go to the toilet, just really made me very oh wow, and also we expect and know that with children, don't we? That I've heard my sister have conversations with my nephew when he was younger to say, you're just hungry, have something to eat, and then he would recognize that he's hungry and that he needed something to eat, and that was why he was grumpy and cross. So We help our children and we scaffold our children to their capacity to understand their physiology. And how we do that with dogs, it just seems like magical. My sister did it with words. We can't communicate those things to a dog. So helping our dogs understand their own physiology is part and parcel of guardianship, of caregiving for dogs. Aren't we all now? I'm like, it's magic that dogs learn these things. Emotion regulation builds on physiological or biological regulation, as well it might, given the physiological nature of many of our emotions and their adaptive value. In humans, it's the ability to regulate our emotions, to use them sometimes, but also to know what we're feeling and how to manage this. So think of young children at Christmas. Young children are often unable to regulate their excitement and anticipation as Christmas grows closer. This affects their physiology and also their interactions with other people. So as we grow up, we get better, I hope, at regulating our explosive fizzy feelings of joy as we age, generally speaking, as well as recognising and accepting or regulating negative feelings too. It isn't always easy for humans, particularly to do so without social support. So we see that social support, mum and dad helping us regulate on Christmas Eve by giving us a warm drink and a film to focus on, rather than stoking the fires and feeding us Haribo sweets and sugary fizzy drinks. So that we actually see that regulating our emotions can regulate our bodies and also our attentional processes and our social relationships. And that in regulating our physiology, our attentional processes, or being supported and regulated by social processes, it's all a two-way street. It's very interactive. So it's all affecting each other all the time. And that's why I like Stuart Shanker's model the best, that it's not categorical or hierarchical. It's an interplay between all of those 5 things, and they're all playing with each other all of the time. And one will influence the other, and that in turn will influence it. And so I like this combination model. It works really well for me in terms of my thinking. Cognitive regulation for our dogs very much relates to 2 major strands: their ability to focus on a task and their ability to ignore distractions. And this comes under the umbrella of attentional processes, and also their ability to appraise novel situations, make sense of the environment. That also falls under appraisal processes. So we know that emotions affect our cognition, particularly our attentional processes, what we're paying attention to, but it also affects our working memory, thinking of things like executive function, for example, and we can see that here. So Thibaut, for example, had these struggles too. Anxiety made him very focused on his female caregiver, but it also made him focus on potential threat when he was uncertain out on walks. And this in turn affected his social relationships and his ability to disengage from the world. Social regulation for our dogs falls into 3 major areas: their behaviour with humans, their behaviour with other dogs, and their behaviour with other social creatures, other creatures like livestock or companion species like cats and rabbits. This is very much about how they behave in themselves. So in a way, it very much builds on emotion regulation. It's very interesting when we think many of us know Panksepp's 7 affective pathways, for example, but 6 of those 7 relate to social processes. Emotions are a social phenomena. Rage, fear, lust, care, panic and play, using a Panksepp model, are largely, if not entirely, social emotions. They help grease the wheel of our interactions with other individuals. We humans and our dogs are social mammals, and self-regulation alone, if we were doing that, self-regulation is just, that would be for lizards. The adaptive value of group living is important, but it's not just about strong defences and being able to find food and mates. It's also about mutually supportive relationships, especially as we develop. It's for sure about teamwork. Prosocial behaviour relates to affiliative behaviour, even such skills as empathy, as that, however that would look for dogs. In a way, if you consider the 4 strands of emotional intelligence, so the first is, number 1, I can recognise my own emotions. Number 2, I can manage my own emotions. Number 3, I can recognise emotions in others. And number 4, I can manage emotions in others. We actually see how regulatory processes in themselves follow the same lines, with physiological, emotional, cognitive regulation being about the self, and social and prosocial regulation being about our interactions with others. If there's one place where I loosely disagree with Shanker's 5 domains model, it's that actually I think prosocial behaviour is part of the circuit beyond this. I think for animals at least, it's a higher level of cognition, the ability to read the room, to regulate accordingly and help others do the same. For instance, we humans don't skip into adult humans don't always skip into funerals full of joy because it's our birthday and it's a glorious day. We know how to moderate and modulate our emotions, our behaviour and our social relationships. But I definitely think some adult dogs will do these things too. And we can see that our dogs will do things to help other dogs feel safe and to feel calm around them. Certainly watching the videos of the Beagle ladies with Tibble, they were trying their very best. They did a marvellous job of being prosocial, and I call them matriarchs at the beginning. They were really nanny dogs, mama dogs, that helping young dogs understand, oh, now is the time to stop play, and doing so in a way that was inoffensive and help the dogs learn to regulate. My dog Heston was a beautiful example of that, and I have got such a lovely video. It's a delicious little video of where he was teaching. I had some puppies in foster, and one of them, Lisa, she was very snappy and she would often bite. She was a little terrier as well, so I didn't want to reinforce her biting behaviours. I really wanted those to stop pretty soon. But she was biting her brother so hard, he was squealing and he was screaming, and she wasn't disengaging from him. So no prosocial behaviour there whatsoever. So watching Heston as sort of, he was 30 kilos to her a handful, I don't know how much she weighed, but he could hear her snapping and so on. And when she got more and more fizzy, he would just very kindly get up, stand up, move away, shake it off. And she then started to do exactly the same. So we see these prosocial behaviours, particularly in adult dogs, that they can not only recognise that the other dog is feeling fizzy, but they know how to help that other dog calm down. And that's what we mean by prosocial behaviours. So I'm not entirely sure that that is something that our animals would necessarily be doing all the time. I think it's almost like a higher level skill. But certainly, these are the dogs that I look for. I use quite a lot of mentor dogs in my work and think about how dogs can influence the behaviour of the dogs. Those 2 Beagle ladies who were perfect with Tibble, but he just wasn't in a place where he could take on board what they were helping him learn, just exactly as he was as well with his human teachers, sorry. It's important also to think that this is very much the gold standard for when we humans are at our best, highly functioning, highly healthy, growth oriented. We're human beings, but we're not self-actualized machines. We also need to understand that all 5 of these domains shouldn't become an ableist golden goal, and that good social support is neither coercive nor removing agency. It's about part of being a social species. So that said, I do think it's important to think about, when are we imposing an agenda or expectations on others, including those of other species. I think it's all very much a fine line. It's very easy to conceptualize, about the non-ordinary individuals that we know. I know plenty. I work with adolescents with ADHD, with dyslexia, with autism. I don't manage their behaviour. I try to have a dialogue with them, their teenagers, about how I can support them better. And I also understand that just because I can do these things, mostly, and I can regulate myself in ways that I find healthy and growth promoting for me, does not mean A, they should, or B, I'm the expert, or C, I'm doing it right. And with all these things in mind, I don't leave them to it either if social support could help. That's not the point of being a social mammal. We are cohesive. So we have some tough conversations about helping our dogs do these things, but we also have to have tough conversations about, is it appropriate to think of our animals self-regulating all of the time? Because sometimes that can be a bit of an ableist golden goal, because we've got a lot of humans who can't manage these things all the time. And to think that just, oh, well, I can, and this is how I conceptualize being healthy and growth oriented, doesn't necessarily mean that it really is, or that it's how I do it is the way that other people can do it or should do it. So I think we've got that kind of like these big ideas to think about, and it's complicated, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, or nor does it mean that we couldn't expect our dog to be able to self-regulate a bit better than they are doing at the moment. In other words, does it matter if our dog can't do it by themselves? I'm not so sure. But I try to apply these principles to our dogs. I don't think that just because I, a grown up adult lady who has had extensive support from various clinical teams in reaching a point where I personally feel like I do a good job on the whole of regulating my own self, I don't think that therefore my dogs should be responsible for regulating themselves all of the time. I try and think about what my dogs need and make sure that I do what helps them to healthy growth and regulatory growth. I try not also to invalidate their feelings, and that's tough. One of my family members at the moment seems to be on a mission to make Liddy more social, and that's tough because it actually invalidates Liddy's concerns about people and about dogs. At the same time, it's undoubtedly unhealthy not to have any friends. I understand that as a social species, leaving our dogs to work things out for themselves is kind of a dereliction of duty as far as being a social species is concerned. We don't walk past people in the street who are crying. When I start to think about agency and the ability to build competencies and build skills to help us in our encounters with novel challenges in the future, we really are just doing our best to make sure that it's right for the dog that we're working with, that's right in front of us in that moment. Like, what's right for them right now, how might that change, and how best can I support them in that moment. But it is a good point to think about the importance of being regulated by others sometimes. Sometimes this is referred to as co-regulation. It is important just to kind of like step back and understand the difference between regulation of the self by the self and being regulated by others. So, of course, the definition of co-regulation is just as unclear, worse still, than the definition for regulation in general. Some use it as a term to mean like a symbiotic process. I regulate you and you regulate me. Well, I don't know about you, but my dogs don't regulate me. I'm aware of also the inherent ableism in that statement I just made, and there is absolutely no judgment on you from my behalf if you have a dog who assists you and makes you feel better in any way and you regulate each other. In many ways, you are probably the living embodiment of a symbiotic definition of co-regulation as an interactive regulatory process. I also acknowledge that there's a lot of research and theory that I confess not to understand as best I should, that of polyvagal theory and co-regulation. I think that this ventures more into the notion of social mammals supporting the regulation of each other, like I regulate you, you regulate me in turn, in those reciprocal ways, almost an involuntary physiological level. I'm not going to touch on that in this session. No, I wanted to just acknowledge that this is an interesting field of research where co-regulation has a different kind of a meaning from the one that I use when I'm talking about it. Co-regulation for me is almost like co-steering in a dual control car. So, and we would be the co-steerer. At first, we, the experienced social mammal with our high levels of self-regulation, we're going to offer a lot of support, intervention if necessary, just as we do with children and dogs. We may offer a lot of support and a lot of structure and make choices on behalf of the other individual so that they can build up the skills to do it themselves in future. Sometimes if they're struggling, we're going to step in and we're going to step up more assertively on their behalf, take feedback from that moment and kind of like go, okay, well, they can't cope with this. Let's set up a learning environment in which they can learn those skills for themselves next time. So in this way, co-regulation just looks like a lot of parenting or mentoring. I'm not even going to call it good parenting or mentoring. But as time passes, less and less should be needed. I really hope that you still don't need your mum in the seat next to you anymore, telling you how to check your mirrors before you signal and manoeuvre. You know, if you're a person of an age such as I think I passed my driving test in 1990. And I like to think in the intervening decades, I have been able to internalise these skills for myself so that nobody ever needs to grab the steering wheel and go, for God's sake, Emma, signal. If I try to overtake on the motorway, I don't need somebody there to help remind me of the skills I need to do that. But it is well worth taking a moment to recognise that when I went looking for an image of learner drivers, the drivers instructors were all men, grabbing the steering wheel like this one, and the learners were all women. I think that says probably quite a lot about why we feel so uncomfortable about notions of co-regulation sometimes, because we see it through the lens, a common lens of control and grabbing steering wheels out of the hands of the less competent. We've got a lot of work to do to make ourselves feel comfortable and move beyond traditional models of control and competence in order to see how co-regulation can be a beneficial process and can be a supportive process, and it doesn't necessarily mean snatching a wheel out of somebody's hand and telling them they're an idiot. So I just thought it was quite interesting to see that image as it popped up, and I searched for ages to find an image. I just wanted a lady driving instructor. My mum partly taught me, I taught my brother. My driving instructor was male. I've got female friends who are driving instructors. I didn't necessarily want to have this man grabbing the wheel of a steering wheel. What kind of an image does that convey? But I thought then actually that's a perfect image, because quite often that's how we think of co-regulation, as a controlling process rather than a supportive process. And for us, it's really hard to find that balance between control and support. To make sure that we're not doing too much control, but at the same time we're not relinquishing control, that we're not, it's not a dereliction of duty. We shouldn't be sitting in that car alongside our dog who's really struggling and not making any intervention whatsoever if they're about to hit the central reservation and topple us over into a quarry somewhere. So on the one hand, we've got control, and on the other, we have got support, and we've got dependence and independence. So that same sliding scale of being regulated by others and regulated by the self is evident in puppies. So when puppies are born, they are dependent physiologically, emotionally, and socially. In terms of self-regulation, there's very little that they can actually yet do. Even in terms of things like voiding their bladder or their bowels, they need a social other, such as their mother, to stimulate their bowels to move. And although they can vocalize their needs in puppy chirps, and though they can move towards heat sources and away from heat sources, their body isn't yet ready to regulate even simple physiological processes like temperature regulation. Our mammalian bodies are designed to be regulated by another, right from the very beginning of our lives. Co-regulation will come in various levels, but I think it can be very easy in cultures who are very individualistic to chase self-regulation, this self-actualization as the be-all and end-all of regulation, in what can actually sometimes be very ableist ways, when in fact this can do an enormous amount of damage if our dogs need support as they are learning to cope. Given that dogs' brains don't reach maturity until 16 weeks, to treat a 10-week-old or a 14-week-old puppy as if they're mature enough to regulate themselves is perhaps giving them less support than they actually need via regulatory processes. So things, for instance, about this kind of, the puppy gets home and from that moment at 8 weeks old, they're treated as a grown-up dog, expected to sleep in a crate through the night in the kitchen, and how we kind of like had that 8-week period, and really we've got another 8 weeks before the puppy's brain is able to cope with that. And to be thinking about how can we better support our puppies so that they're developing really well, rather than just building up anxiety about what happens when I'm on my own, and anxiety over who I'm sleeping with or where I'm sleeping and how long I'm supposed to sleep for. From rodent models, we've known for 20 years that maternal care during the first weeks affects the ways in which their offspring will cope with stress in later life. Better maternal care leads to better coping later. Licking and grooming regulate the development of biological, endocrine, emotional and behavioural processes and responses to stress in the offspring, and they also create a template or a blueprint for how the animal cope with stress in later life. Early maternal care affects the HPA stress pathway, the SAM pathway and the sympathetic nervous system response. It affects cortisol production. It affects the hippocampus and how we learn and how we remember things. It affects our sensitivity to negative feedback. It affects the sensitivity of the amygdala. We also have ample evidence from dog research, particularly from working dog lines and programs and assistance dog programs. As Foyer and colleagues in 2016 said, and this is so profound, early experiences and variation in maternal care may be as important as genetics in their impact on social behaviour and levels of aggression. So important. The maternal care that our puppies receive in the first 3 weeks of life help them cope with stressful situations and adapt better to the environment. It helps them learn the skills to regulate. The very natural process by which the mother spends less time with puppies is part of early tolerance of unpleasant situation, of not being able to have your needs met immediately. And if carers or puppy mill owners are not giving the mother choices about how and when to move away, then following this with sudden and prolonged separations that quite often happen in these situations, that can quite easily cause very early dysregulation of frustration, early frustration tolerance. We do, I think, need to be very sensitive as puppies move through weaning, that the mother can come and go as she needs to, so that puppies can develop an ability to self-regulate their frustration on that sliding scale, as well as having their needs met by their mother. Abrupt weaning may cause any number of disruptions in the normal development of regulatory skills. Several studies have looked at the effect of early removal of puppies from the litter, including two by Pierre Antoni and colleagues, where long-lasting behavioural effects of early weaning or early removal from the mother included a large number, very large number of those that we might think of as dysregulation, creating TIBOs in a way. Destructiveness, excessive barking, reluctance to relinquish toys, resource guarding, behaviours designed to solicit guardian attention, all more prevalent in dogs who were removed abruptly during early weaning compared to puppies who were removed after 8 weeks from the litter. They're all potentially frustration-related behaviours as well, which shows just how important weaning is to the development of emotional and behavioural regulatory skills. So important. As puppies age, their learning relates to their own bodies. They're learning about their bodies, they're learning proprioception, they're learning coordination, they're learning balance. It also relates though to their social relationships and affects adolescence. And adolescence is a very, very hard thing to define in dogs. It's not well agreed and it's not well defined. And there are reasons for this. It's not clear cut. You can't see overnight, a stroke of midnight and the 7th month birthday that they become an adolescent. We don't see that necessarily, that change from a happy child to a surly teenager. We know that real life isn't like that, and the further away we get from those early developmental milestones, the things that should happen at 21 days and by 5 weeks and 8 weeks, actually reminds us by adolescence that it's a very nebulous phase. And we know also many entrants to shelters are adolescents. It's not a coincidence, it's more complicated. Rather, we probably just have to say adolescence is hard, but certainly, like I said, my experience today has been it's all adolescence. It doesn't always go like that, it's just, I think, coincidence. But I do get, and I'm sure trainers and behaviourists get, far more clients who are adolescents who are struggling to learn how to regulate than many other kinds of problem. And certainly if we can nip these problems in the bud during adolescence, it means then the dog has got much more successes going on to live as an adult. But equally, it can be really hard to get that with a teenager if they never learned in the first place, when they were much younger, how to regulate for later life. We also have to be careful not to generalise from human neuroscience and psychology to canine behaviour. It's another conversation I've had this week. Yes, things happen to the adolescent body. Yes, we know a fair amount about this in humans. What do we know about this in mammals, in dogs in particular? Less. We have to take those from primates sometimes and from rodents. But what we do know is that across mammalian species, adolescence is marked by increases in reward seeking and in sensation seeking, and also increases in risk-taking behaviour as well. We also see increases in social interactions beyond that immediate family group. So adolescents are also very sensitive to aversive stimuli, but they're also more sensitive to rewards. Emotional arousal is more likely. We see lower latency for emotional responses, like they happen more quickly, but we also see them lasting longer and seeing more of those intense responses, especially in social contexts. So co-regulation, where we work to support our dogs, comes in several different layers. We can support them through managing the environment for them. So each time we make a choice that makes their life easier, where it also makes our dog more likely to succeed, so we're not just removing them from all complication. This is our first layer of co-regulatory emotional support. If we take our dogs to a secure field, if we prevent them from seeing out the car, if we choose walks with fewer off-lead dogs, then we're managing the environment for success. But we can go a step further. Creating an errorless learning environment is the first level of that. So we can actually set up that we can change the situation, take different walks, for example, but still give our dogs the opportunity to learn. But we can also create predictable schedules, build in scaffolded unpredictability. That can help as well. So whenever we're making these choices, just like we might when we're teaching a learner driver how to drive, we're going to take them in the places where they're going to experience times when they're going to be competent and feel confidence, where they know what they're doing. We aren't going to throw them into the challenges and the difficulties. And at the same time, we aren't just going to remove them completely from all of the challenges. One of my French friends, she talks about how she learned to drive in Tahiti. She says it was basically one road. She got a French driver's license there, and then she struggled when she came back and she had to drive in French towns. So we have those moments, don't we, where we can choose, am I going to take my dog to the equivalent of driving on that one road in Tahiti, wherever it was, where my friend got her driver's license. I'm sure she was kidding as well. Or am I going to also, be there with them whilst they're doing the difficult thing and they're navigating those more challenging roads and those more challenging situations? And both are perfect models. There are times when we're going to just say, it's going to be Tahiti roads today. Let's just take the easy route. And then there are times when we're going to say, I think it would be really healthy for you to let's loose on some more challenging roads and let's help progress your skills a little bit. To learn to drive in Tahiti. We can also help our dogs choose where to focus though and help them gradually learn to ignore distractions. This really falls under cognitive co-regulation here, given that these are cognitive skills. I think there's often a tension in rewards-based training about how much of this is necessary or helpful, or whether to do it at all and just let the dog choose where they focus. But I'd argue that this puts too much onus on the dog without taking account of the importance of helping our dog to focus. Sometimes we need to say, look, there's a truck coming, be careful. Sometimes, particularly for young dogs and adolescents or grouchy adult dogs, we may need to step up when their brain is already working at full capacity. Attentional control enables us to disengage from emotionally arousing situations, and so sometimes we're going to need to help our dogs and support them do that, knowing where and how to pay attention to particular things, those little things that we would do naturally with a learner driver, watch your speed, change gear, just reminding them when they've got other things going on, helping them a little bit know where to focus their attention and their behaviour in that moment. Exactly the same kind of skills that we'll do with our dogs to help them manage their cognitive regulation and what to pay attention to and what not. If our dogs are fearful, they may need some time and space to reappraise things that scare them. And this is another cognitive regulatory process rather than emotional necessarily, but it allows for emotional regulation. So we also need to be mindful of the influences of breed on behaviour, as well as the fact that we bred dogs in general to go in rather than to go back, and that sometimes we might need to help the dog cool down a little bit before we go back. So just as a really good example this morning of how I helped Liddy co-regulate, it'd been quite windy in the night and quite a lot of branches had fallen down from the trees. I don't know if dogs had been past and peed on them, if cats had been past. I was not about to smell that the branches on the floor. If cats had been past and peed on them, whether they smelt of birds, whether they picked up odours of being high, I don't know. But she was very interested in one particular branch and she was pulling me very strongly towards this branch. So it wasn't that I was not going to go in with that for that, but she was too hot to go in and appraise that situation calmly. So what we did is we went away, we did some little impulse control exercises, help Liddy remember that she's in charge of her body and not her body in charge of her. And then we went back when she was cooler and she smelled it. She was there for quite a while and then she peed on it. So it was obviously something offensive to her, or letting the other dogs know that she'd been there. But it took her some time to kind of process that. And if she'd have gone in on that first one, on that first occasion, she'd have failed. She would have been so hot that she wouldn't have been able to regulate it, to appraise it, to down-regulate it, to move it into something insignificant. And it would probably become a battle of wills, and she would have been really hot under the collar about it. Simply moving her away a little bit, giving her some space, and then going back when she was cool enough to process it and down-regulate it and to give her time to do it, that was absolutely perfect. And that was a little decision I just made in the moment, because those are the kind of things that we're doing to support our dogs. And at the same time, I didn't also go, no, I'm not going down there. You know, I could see that it was interesting for her to appraise. It was important for her to appraise. And I also know, because of her breed, she's much more likely to go in than she is to avoid it. So working with Thibaut, he would have noticed it and avoided it, whereas Liddy noticed it and wanted to move towards it. So it involves co-regulation, involves a real appreciation and understanding and a lot of observation of the dogs that we're working with, which is why it's such a hard skill as well, on top of everything else about how much and how do we move from control to support, and how do we know when to step in and control, and how do we know when to offer that support. You know, the difficulties of being a driving instructor, if you will. We can also, at any point in the process, teach skills discreetly. So I've taught Liddy to disengage from things. We might shape emotional self-management, manifesting through cognition and behaviour in such ways like we might promote the teaching of calm, teaching proprioception, teaching frustration tolerance, teaching impulse control. These are all skills that I've taught to Liddy separately. For instance, if I'm working with a dog, an exuberant dog who's got little impulse control, you know, lots of those big joyous emotions, but they're knocking Granny over, and in actual fact, you know, I suspect that this obnoxious and obsequious over-greeting is just a heady mix of anxiety and impulsivity, I might teach them to shoulder target, to legs, or even do a hip check. And then we can cue that when the moment is right and build new behaviours that serve to regulate emotions. Remember that it's a feedback loop. So this morning, Liddy wouldn't have disengaged from the smell. I had to encourage her to disengage, and then we could go back. So we come back to Stuart Shanker's model of that everything affecting each other all of the time, and that those biological processes are affecting emotional process, affecting cognitive processes, affecting social processes, not so much the social this morning, but they're all affecting each other all of the time, and we can't see them as distinct categories or as a hierarchy that we need to do one in order to have the others, that we have got this complex interplay, this feedback that goes both ways, that bi-directional feedback, that our dogs are using these skills all of the time, and influencing one will undoubtedly influence the others as well. And when we've done those skills, we're right there. We enter the realm of self-regulation. Hooray! But how do we know which level to support at? Big questions. Managing the environment, prompting behaviour means that we're a crutch for our dogs. We've got a lot of that control still. And the dog isn't also internalising what we're doing. Sometimes we're going to need to do that anyway. But I try to avoid things that are done to the dog and not done by the dog, because they've got no control over the process. But at the same time, if we don't support our dogs enough, they will struggle. We're always looking for that Goldilocks level of self-regulation, of co-regulation as well. Just like managing that dual control car or co-piloting a plane, it's really important knowing when to support our learners' choices and when we need to slam on the brakes and step up. It's also complicated by the fact that needs will vary. I'll need to do more dual control driving if it's icy or raining than I would on straight sunny roads. I'll need to do more prompting and intervention on Spaghetti Junction than I would on a wide, broad A road through deserted areas. My friend in Tahiti will have needed less co-regulation and would have reached self-regulation much more quickly there, but transplanted into a new area, she's going to need that support again. So today it was windy, it was fizzy, Liddy, there was things on the floor that weren't there on the floor yesterday, and she needed just that little bit more support and awareness from me than she would have done normally when she's calm enough and cool enough to manage it herself. So I also can recognize her physiological dysregulation more easily to know that she's also emotionally, cognitively, and socially and behaviorally dysregulated. So for me, when I start to notice her pulling on the lead, that's the prime thing that her ability to regulate herself is slipping. So that becomes a really good signal for me, particularly when it's dark and it's early in the morning and I'm not concentrating as much as I might do normally. But to assume that regulation just happens is to misunderstand the whole point of being a social species. These skills don't develop in isolation. I'm pretty sure Lydia would be a stuck record if I'd not had some influence there. But they're also highly individualised and highly variable. We've all got individual developmental needs where guidance of adults helps make up for our personal deficits and our weaknesses. I tolerate frustration really poorly, and sometimes having people to step in really helps. It's really helpful. It all helps us become a functioning individual. As with everything in life, it's always a fine balance. It's a balance between prescriptive and permissive, the balance between individual needs and societal expectations, the balance between immediate gratification and delayed gratification. But we're also influenced by culture in our westernized societies. You know, it's a source of shame to depend on each other, to need somebody else to tell you to back off from the internet today. It carries such shame. We, sing songs asking people to lean on us when they're not strong, but there's such a stigma on that and this push towards this gold standard of self-regulation, as if co-regulation is just for children or for the incapable. It's never easy to know that we're doing the right thing, but as long as we're thinking about it and as long as we're informed, then we're bound to make better decisions than we would if we were working, from a position of ignorance. If you're looking for more, all of the Lighten Up materials, all of them are focused on regulation to one extent or another. You can find my 42 skills, 42, in the resilience workshop on my Teachable site. There's plenty of free materials as well, from the resilience roadmap to my various assessments to help you understand how well your dog copes with those 8 crucial skills and how well they regulate in various different ways. And if you're not sure where to look, as always, feel free to send me a message. If you found this content useful, could I ask you to hit the thumbs up button on YouTube or the subscribe button if you've not subscribed already, and pass it on to anyone else that you think might find it useful.